In the harshest of conditions, a young boy's selfless act of heroism challenges everything the world thinks it knows about race, bravery, and humanity. Tonight, a simple gesture of kindness will change everything, not only for one life, but for an entire community. The wind howled through the empty road, carrying with it the biting chill of winter. Snow stretched for miles, untouched except for the footprints Malik left behind as he walked, his thin jacket offering little protection against the cold. His breath came in short, visible puffs, his hands buried deep in his pockets as he moved forward, one step at a time. The night had swallowed the world whole, leaving nothing but silence and shadows in its wake. Then a sound shattered the stillness, a cry, weak, broken, and desperate. Malik froze. His heart pounded as his eyes darted across the icy road. At first, he thought the wind had played a cruel trick on him. But then he saw it. A figure, small and unmoving, sprawled across the pavement. A girl. Malik's feet moved before his mind could catch up. He ran toward her, his pulse thundering in his ears. As he got closer, his stomach clenched. Blood stained the snow beneath her dark and thick, spreading like ink across the ice. Her skin was ghostly pale, her body trembling. She wasn't just hurt, she was dying. Malik dropped to his knees beside her. "Hey," he whispered, his voice barely carrying over the wind. "Hey, can you hear me?" She didn't respond. His fingers hovered over her face, searching for any sign of warmth, any flicker of life. She was barely breathing, her lips a frozen shade of blue. And then, in the distance, he heard something else. A low, guttural sound growing louder by the second. Malik turned his head, and his blood ran cold. A truck, barreling toward them, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin daggers. Malik's breath hitched. The road was pure ice. He could hear the tires skidding, the brakes screaming, the driver fighting for control. But the truck wasn't stopping. It couldn't stop. And the girl was right in its path. Malik's body moved on instinct. He grabbed her shoulders, but she was heavier than he expected, her limbs limp, unresponsive. The truck's horn blared a final warning before impact. He had seconds to act. With every ounce of strength in his small body, he pulled. His fingers dug into her coat, his feet slipping against the ice as he fought to drag her out of the way. The headlights bore down on them, bright enough to turn night into day. Malik gritted his teeth, pulled harder. The roar of the engine drowned out everything. And then, a crash. Snow and ice exploded into the air. The world tilted. Malik felt himself thrown backward, his body colliding with the frozen ground. Pain shot through him, but he barely noticed. His heart pounded as he looked up, his chest heaving. The truck had stopped inches from where they had been. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the driver stumbled out, his breath coming in rapid gasps, his eyes wide with horror. He wasn't looking at Malik. He was looking at the girl. Malik forced himself up, his muscles aching. He turned toward her, his chest tight with fear. She was still there, still unconscious, but alive. Malik let out a shaky breath, his hands trembling as he reached for her again. His fingers brushed against her cheek, reassuring himself that she was real, that he had done it, that he had saved her. The driver was speaking now, his voice frantic, but Malik wasn't listening, because in that moment none of it mattered. Not the cold biting at his skin, not the pain radiating through his body, not the fact that he was just a homeless boy no one had ever looked twice at before. All that mattered was that he had made a choice, and because of that choice, she was still breathing. Malik had never known a life of warmth. From as far back as he could remember, the world had made it clear that he did not belong. He had no home, no family to welcome him after a long day, no warm bed to crawl into when the nights grew unbearably cold. He had learned early on that the world did not stop for boys like him, black, homeless, forgotten. He had spent years walking these streets, his presence met with the same rehearsed indifference from the people who passed him. Shopkeepers watched him like a threat. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, and even those who meant well did little more than cast him pitying glances before moving on with their lives. Malik had stopped expecting kindness a long time ago. He had stopped expecting anything from this town. Yet despite it all, his heart had never hardened. He had never let the hatred around him make him cruel. He had never stopped believing that somewhere, somehow, there had to be more than this, and perhaps that was why. When he saw the girl lying in the snow, when he saw her small, fragile body trembling against the frozen pavement, he had not hesitated, because no one had ever saved him. But he could save her. The girl's life had been the opposite of Malik's in every way. Where he had known hunger, she had known comfort. Where he had spent his nights curled up in alleyways, shivering beneath tattered blankets, she had rested in a bed so large she could disappear beneath its covers. She had been born into privilege, into a family whose wealth had shielded them from the kind of suffering Malik endured every day. But wealth had not saved her from neglect. Her parents, too wrapped up in their own carefully constructed world, had given her everything except their attention. They had surrounded her with expensive gifts, but had never stopped long enough to ask if she was truly happy. They had built her a life that sparkled on the surface but was hollow underneath. And because of that indifference, she had found herself alone on this icy road bleeding into the snow. Because no one had been watching, no one had seen her. Just like no one had ever seen Malik. The town itself had been built on separation. It was the kind of place where the rich lived high on the hill, their houses lined with perfectly trimmed hedges, their cars gliding down smooth roads as if untouched by the world beyond their gates. And then there was Malik's world. The side of town where the streetlights flickered, where the roads cracked under years of neglect, where people struggled to make it through the day while others turned their backs. Malik had been born on the wrong side of that divide. The girl had been born on the other. And yet, in the moment he had heard her cry, none of that had mattered. All that had mattered was saving her. Now, standing on the side of that road, his hands still shaking, Malik realized something. For the first time in his life, the world could not ignore him. The truck driver, who would have never looked twice at him before, was staring at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. The girl, barely conscious, had been saved by someone she had likely never even noticed before. And soon, the rest of the town would know. They would know that the boy they had spent years pretending didn't exist had risked his life for one of their own. They would be forced to confront a truth they had spent years avoiding, that Malik, despite everything, despite their rejection and cruelty, had chosen compassion over indifference. And that was something no amount of money, no amount of privilege, could ever erase. The roar of the truck swallowed everything, the wind, the cold, the darkness. It was coming too fast, its tires skidding against the ice, the brakes screeching in a desperate but failing attempt to stop. Malik didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He ran. His feet barely touched the ground as he lunged toward the girl, his breath coming in short gasps, his body moving purely on instinct. She was still unconscious, her small form barely visible against the snow, completely unaware of the danger racing toward her. The truck's horn blared, a warning, a plea, a final desperate sound before impact. Malik threw himself over her. He wrapped his arms around her limp body, pressing her against the frozen pavement, shielding her with everything he had. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the collision, for the pain, for whatever came next. Then, impact. The world exploded. The force sent him rolling, his body slamming against the ice, his limbs burning as they scraped against the unforgiving ground. His head hit something hard, and for a moment everything blurred, the lights, the sound, the stars above. And then, silence. Somewhere, in the distance, voices were screaming. Malik's eyes fluttered open, but everything was spinning. His body ached in places he didn't even know could hurt. He tried to move, but pain shot through his ribs, sharp and unrelenting. His breath hitched, but he forced himself to focus. The girl. Where was she? His fingers twitched against the cold ground. Snowflakes drifted into his vision, dissolving against his skin. He turned his head, wincing as pain lanced through his skull. Then he saw her. She was still there, lying inches away, her face peaceful, untouched. Alive. Malik let out a shaky breath, relief washing over him even as the pain screamed through his body. He had done it. He had saved her. The truck had stopped. It sat mere feet away, steam rising from its hood, its front bumper dented from where it had clipped Malik instead of the girl. The driver stumbled out, his face pale, his hands shaking as he ran toward them. "God," the man muttered, dropping to his knees beside Malik. "Oh, God!" More voices. Footsteps crunching against the snow. People were gathering now, their faces blurring together in Malik's hazy vision. Some gasped, some whispered. Others just stared. They weren't staring at the girl. They were staring at him, because they had never noticed him before, because for the first time they had to. He saved her, someone murmured. A woman covered her mouth, eyes wide in disbelief. "That's the homeless kid, the one that's always around town." "The boy?" another voice whispered. "Him?" The disbelief in their voices cut deeper than the pain in his ribs, because he knew what they were thinking. They had never looked twice at him before. They had walked past him 100 times, never stopping, never wondering if he was cold or hungry or hurting. To them, he had been nothing more than a shadow, a part of the background, just another face they could ignore. And yet, here he was. Lying broken on the ground, his body aching, his breath coming in shallow gasps, because he had thrown himself in front of a truck to save a girl who didn't even know his name. The irony of it all made his head swim. Sirens wailed in the distance. Bright, flashing lights filled the night, painting the snow in streaks of red and blue. Paramedics rushed forward, their voices urgent, their hands moving quickly as they assessed the damage. "He's hurt bad," one of them said. "We need to get him to the hospital now." Malik wanted to tell them he was fine. He wanted to say that he had been through worse, that he had spent years surviving without anyone's help. But he was so tired. His body felt heavy, and for the first time in his life, he let himself be cared for. As they lifted him onto the stretcher, as the world around him blurred, Malik heard one final voice. The girl. She was awake now, her voice weak, barely a whisper. But it reached him. "You saved me," she murmured. Malik's lips twitched, just slightly, just enough to form the smallest smile. And then everything faded to black. The town had always been good at pretending. For years they had ignored the boy on the streets, the one who walked past their shops with hollow eyes and empty pockets. They had whispered about him when he lingered too long near the marketplace, had clutched their purses tighter when he passed by. They had convinced themselves that he was nothing more than a burden, a shadow, a nameless problem they weren't responsible for solving. But now they couldn't look away, because Malik had saved one of theirs. The hospital was quiet except for the beeping of machines and the occasional murmur of nurses moving through the halls. Malik lay in a hospital bed, bandages wrapped around his ribs, his body aching from the impact of the truck. He had barely been awake since they brought him in, exhaustion pulling him under each time he tried to open his eyes. But outside his room, the world was changing. People who had never given him a second thought were now speaking his name in hushed voices, their words laced with disbelief and guilt. That boy, Malik, he saved her. He actually saved her. I never even noticed him before. How could we have been so blind? I always assumed, he was just another street kid. I never thought. No one finished their sentences, too ashamed to say out loud what had been so easy to believe before, that he hadn't mattered. The girl's parents had arrived at the hospital within hours of the accident. They had been frantic at first, their worry consuming every thought as they rushed to their daughter's side. But when they heard what had happened, when they learned who had risked everything to save her, their faces drained of color. The realization hit them harder than any accusation ever could. They had never spoken to Malik before, not once. They had seen him, of course. They had watched him from the comfort of their car windows, passing by him as he sat on street corners, his clothes thin and worn, his eyes too old for a child his age. They had assumed things about him, that he was trouble, that he was dangerous, that he was nothing. And yet, when their daughter had been lying helpless in the snow, when her life had hung in the balance, it had been Malik, not them, who had acted. The guilt was suffocating. When Malik finally woke, the first thing he saw was the girl sitting beside his bed. Her face was still pale, but her eyes were clear, her expression unreadable as she looked at him. "You're awake," she said softly. Malik blinked at her, his throat dry. He tried to speak, but his voice barely came out as a whisper. "You okay?" The girl nodded. "Because of you." A silence stretched between them, heavy with words neither of them knew how to say. Then, from the doorway, her parents appeared. They looked different than they had before, less polished, less sure of themselves. Their usual air of superiority had been replaced by something else, something uncertain, something humbled. The father was the first to speak. His voice, normally so steady, cracked just slightly. "Malik," he said, and it was the first time he had ever spoken his name. We owe you everything." Malik said nothing, waiting. The mother stepped forward next, her hands wringing together. "We judged you unfairly," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "We looked at you and assumed the worst, when all along you were braver than any of us." Malik's fingers curled against the blanket covering him. He didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to being acknowledged, to being seen. But they weren't finished. "We were wrong," the father continued. "Not just about you, but about everything. And we will spend the rest of our lives making sure we never make that mistake again." Malik studied them, searching for any hint of dishonesty. He found none. They meant it. For the first time in his life, someone who had once looked down on him was now looking up. and that, more than anything, told him that the world he had known before the accident, the world that had ignored him, cast him aside, was no longer the same. Outside, the town still whispered, but the whispers were different now. They were not filled with judgment, not dripping with the same quiet prejudice they had once carried. Instead, they were filled with something new, with reflection, with regret, with the realization that they had been wrong and that they could never go back to the way things were before. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something better. For the first time in his life, Malik didn't wake up cold. The blankets wrapped around him were thick and warm, a stark contrast to the thin layers he had grown used to on the streets. The steady beep of hospital machines filled the air, and the scent of antiseptic clung to everything. But he didn't mind, because he was alive, because the girl was alive, because somehow the world was different now. The girl's family didn't leave his side. They had spent hours at the hospital, ensuring he had the best care, speaking to doctors, making arrangements he didn't fully understand. It felt strange to have people worry about him, to have someone ask if he was comfortable, if he needed anything. He had spent so long fighting to survive on his own that he didn't know how to accept help without expecting it to disappear. But the help didn't disappear. The girl's father came to him first. He sat by Malik's bedside, hands clasped tightly together as if still struggling with the weight of his own guilt. "We can never repay you for what you did," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "But we want to try." Malik frowned slightly, unsure what he meant. The mother spoke next, her gaze softer than it had ever been before. "You deserve a home," she said, "a real home. If you'd let us, we'd like to give you one. A home." The words settled into Malik's chest, heavy with meaning. He had never had one. Not really. He had slept in abandoned buildings, in alleyways, in shelters when he was lucky. But a home, a place where he belonged, where he didn't have to wonder if he would be turned away, was something he had never dared to dream about. And yet, here it was, being offered to him freely. Malik swallowed hard. Why? The girl's father inhaled deeply, his eyes filled with something Malik had never seen in them before. "Respect, because we were wrong about you," he admitted. "About a lot of things." Malik looked at the girl, sitting beside her parents, her hands folded in her lap. She met his gaze and nodded. "You saved me," she whispered. "You didn't have to, but you did." She was right. No one had ever saved him. Yet when the moment came, he hadn't hesitated. And that had changed everything. Word of what had happened spread quickly. The town that had once ignored him, that had cast him aside without a second thought, was now forced to reckon with the truth. Malik wasn't just the boy they had overlooked. He was the boy who had saved a life. And that realization shattered something within them. People who had once turned away from him now approached him with hesitant smiles and outstretched hands. Shopkeepers who had once chased him off their doorsteps now greeted him by name. Strangers who had never looked twice at him now stopped to ask how he was doing. It was awkward at first, the way people struggled to find the right words, to bridge the gap between who they had been and who they were trying to be. But Malik could see it, the effort, the discomfort, the quiet shame. And maybe that was enough, because change never happened all at once. It happened in small moments, in hesitant kindnesses, in uncomfortable conversations. It happened when people chose to be better, even when it was hard. And if Malik's story had been the thing to start that change, then maybe everything he had been through, all the nights spent alone, all the pain, all the struggle, hadn't been for nothing. As he stepped out of the hospital weeks later, the cold air hit his face, but it didn't feel the same as before. He wasn't the same as before. The streets that had once been his only home were now just a part of his past. He had a future now, one filled with possibilities he had never dared to imagine. He had a home. He had a family. And for the first time, he had hope. People often spoke of heroes as if they were something distant, something larger than life. But Malik knew the truth. A hero wasn't someone with power or privilege. A hero was someone who chose to do what was right, even when no one was watching, even when the world had told them they didn't matter, even when it meant risking everything. And if a homeless boy, invisible to the world, could become a hero, then maybe anyone could. The world had always been cold to Malik, not just in the way winter sank into his bones as he curled up on frozen sidewalks, nor in the way the wind cut through the thin layers of fabric he used to shield himself. The cold had come from people, from the way they looked at him, or rather, the way they didn't. Indifference had been his greatest enemy, and silence had been his constant companion. But now, everything was different. Now, people said his name with something close to reverence. Now, he was no longer just a forgotten boy on the streets. Now, he was a hero. The town had never expected change to come from someone like Malik. But when he had thrown himself into danger without hesitation, when he had saved a girl who had never even noticed him before that night, the world had been forced to stop and listen. His story had spread, and with it came a ripple effect, one that reached further than anyone could have imagined. World had told him he never would. His story would be told for years to come. People would speak of the homeless boy who had saved a life, of the moment that had changed a town forever. But Malik didn't care about the legacy. He didn't care about the headlines or the whispers or the way people looked at him differently now. He only cared about one thing, that he had proven something the world had always tried to deny. That anyone, no matter where they came from, no matter what they had or didn't have, could be a hero. That love and courage were not reserved for the wealthy, the powerful, the ones born into privilege. That sometimes the people society ignored were the ones who had the most to give. And that, no matter how dark the night, no matter how cold the world became, one act of kindness could change everything. The shopkeepers who had once shooed him away began to reconsider the way they treated the unseen people in their own town. The parents who had once warned their children to stay away from his kind found themselves questioning why they had been so quick to judge. The girl's family, once shielded by privilege and ignorance, became vocal about their past mistakes, using their influence to push for change in a town that had long needed it. People who had lived their entire lives in a bubble of comfort and certainty were now forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. They had been wrong about Malik, about the people like him, about everything they thought they knew. And while change would never come overnight, while old habits and prejudices would take years to fully dismantle, something had shifted, and that shift had begun with him. Malik had never wanted to be a hero. He had never wanted attention, never sought the kind of recognition that now followed him wherever he went. He had only wanted to do what was right, because no one had ever saved him, because he knew what it was like to be abandoned, to be left in the cold, to have the world turn its back and pretend not to see. He had known that pain all his life. And that was why, when faced with the choice, he had done the only thing his heart would allow. He had chosen love. The weight of what he had done settled into him slowly, not just in the pain that lingered from his injuries, not just in the exhaustion that clung to his bones after weeks of recovery, but in the quiet moments where he realized just how much had changed. For the first time, he had a place to sleep that wasn't a street corner, or a shelter that could turn him away at any moment. For the first time, he had people who asked how he was doing, who listened when he spoke, who saw him as something more than a shadow. For the first time, he had a future that wasn't just about surviving another day, because one night, in the dead of winter, he had made a choice to act, a choice to care.